Okay, well, good evening, everyone. My name is Les Smith. I'm with the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's webinar, the former Marquette County Airport. This is the MPART PFAS Town Hall. Thank you for joining us this evening. Before we get to our first presenter, we have a couple of housekeeping slides to go over. This might be new to some, but pretty familiar to several others. I just wanted to let you know that we are recording the webinar for future viewing. If you have an opportunity to share it with friends or colleagues that were not able to join this evening. Also want to let you know that your lines are muted, but that's okay because there's a couple of ways that you can communicate with tonight's panel. We do have the Q&A box located in the bottom of your screen in Zoom. You can type your questions in at any time during the webinar today. During the question and answer session this evening, you also have the ability to electronically raise your hand by selecting the hand icon at the bottom of your screen. And presently, we don't have anyone on the call listening in yet, but in case we do, there's an option for them as well. We have about 19 attendees at the moment that have joined us for this evening's conversation. With that, I would like to turn the virtual platform over to Abby Hendershot, who is the Executive Director for the Michigan PFAS Action Response Team. Abby, it is yours.
All right, thank you, Les. And I'll talk a little bit slow just so we can give a few more people time to jump in here, because I'm sure we're going to have, we had at least 10 more people who had registered for the meeting. So as I said, I am Abigail Hendershot, the MPART Executive Director for the Michigan PFAS Action Response Team. I'm happy to talk with you tonight and bring you some important information about what we're calling the former Marquette County Airport in Negaunee. And you are here at what we consider an MPART PFAS Town Hall. It will be recorded and we will be posting it back to the MPART website for future viewing. So introductions, myself, I will be going through the MPART overview, kind of giving you an idea of PFAS and how we got here, what MPART is. Bill Farrell is one of our lead toxicologists from the Department of Health and Human Services. He's going to be talking about PFAS and health. Steve Harrington is one of our senior project managers with the Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. He's going to give you the full details on the investigation that's been done to date, as well as some of the investigation activities on the airport. And then I'll come back, wrap it all up with a quick tour of the website, and then we'll get into the specific questions. So feel free to ask those questions in the Q&A box, and we will keep them all for the end. Or you can raise your hand at the end if you'd rather not have to type it in and you want to ask a question, feel free to do that. But we'll save those all for the end. There'll be plenty of time for questions and answers. So let's get into some of the basics. The MPART team, the Michigan PFAS Action Response Team, was created under an executive order. The first time it was created in 2017 under Governor Snyder, and then now endures as an executive order 2019 under Governor Whitmer, was really created to establish this collaboration structure. It's a very unique multi-agency approach, so it incorporates 7 different departments across the state of Michigan, and really leads to high-level coordination and cooperation among all of those departments on all things PFAS. This is a very, very unique thing. And so it helps us to direct all of our strategies on PFAS and keep those logistics going. So, and this is really that reason that MPART has been so successful, is because of this collaboration coordination structure that we've been able to leverage so much good work in the state of Michigan. So let's go to the basics of what are PFAS. And I say PFAS with the very hard course A because I'm talking about the whole family of PFAS compounds. There's a whole family that's at least 5,000 to 8,000 different compounds made up in there, but we're going to talk about some specific ones, including PFOS. Some people call that PFOS, and PFOA is PFOA. Those are all different individual compounds, and they're the ones that we have the most information for, and that we'll be talking about more today. But all of them have very strong carbon-fluorine bonds. That's what makes the family of chemicals so unique, because they repel water, oils, fats, grease. And when we start talking about the uses, you're going to realize right away how prevalent they are in our commercial and industrial uses. So some of the uses that you guys know about already are, we have Scotchgard in our carpets. We have PFAS in our food packaging. We, can get our couch sprayed down with stain resistant stuff before it comes back from the store. We have PFAS in our cosmetics. Our outdoor gear is usually rainproofed, right? The clothing. Adhesives and sealants also have some PFAS materials. A lot of protective coatings for shoes, for all kinds of things. Teflon, we know there's a lot of nonstick cookware that had PFOS, PFOA coatings. And then the one over here in the bottom right-hand corner, the firefighting foam, is something that you wouldn't necessarily think about, but we use it a lot in our environment, obviously for emergency response. And so there are two types of firefighting foam, and one does have can have high levels of PFOS in the firefighting foam. And so it's been an issue for groundwater contamination. So, but why are we concerned about PFAS? One of the issues is we're finding it because it's in so many of our commercial and industrial products. We're finding PFAS in a lot of different parts of our ecosystem that we didn't expect it to be. It's also very hard to break down. It doesn't biodegrade in our environment. And so once it gets into our environment, it stays there for a very long time. The other really big issue is that PFAS can bioaccumulate. That means it's going to build up in our bodies. It can build up in fish. Certain of every different PFAS compound has a little bit different level of which it might bioaccumulate in your body, but we know PFOS is definitely one that will bioaccumulate over time. And we know that there are some health effects, but a lot of that data is still preliminary. We're still going through it, but we know there are health effects that Bill will talk to you here in just a moment. At the national level, we really have no standards for PFAS. There's some guidelines, there's some health advisories, but no strict standards for drinking water, which we're also going to talk about. So I like to show this particular, diagram because it really shows the ecosystem, and in a very simple terms, it can show you the complexity of PFAS. So if you have, if we start over here on the left side, we have an industry that uses PFAS as part of its industrial products. So think about a manufacturer that might be doing some sort of coating on one of their products. Well, when they discharge their wastewater from the industry to the wastewater treatment plant, or maybe they discharge it straight to the stream, or they have in an unintentional groundwater release. There's different ways that PFAS can get into the environment, but we also have a wastewater treatment plant here that's not really designed for treatment of PFAS. So the complexity of PFAS is it continues to cycle through these different phases, and there's many different ways that ends up in our groundwater. And so one of those that we're talking about today is firefighting foam here, which when applied to the ground can lead to groundwater contamination and can be a source of PFOS for accumulation in fish as well as drinking water. You will see that there's many, many lines here that get down and connect with the groundwater as potential sources of groundwater contamination that end up in our residential homes. So the other thing we will talk about is surface water investigations, and we'll talk about that in some of the site investigation slides. We do a lot of, we've done a lot of surface water investigations in the state, sampling the water, sampling the fish, sampling the foam. We see the water itself doesn't have really high concentrations. We see very high concentrations of PFOS in the foam because of the chemical structure. It likes to ride on that surface water air interface right at the very tippy top of the water column. And so you get a little bit of wind and it generates its own foam. And then we see, the higher levels sometimes in the fish. And so we'll talk about the Eat Safe Fish Guide here too. So one of the things that Michigan and MPART has done is set drinking water standards. As I said, we don't have drinking water standards at the national level for any of the PFAS family compounds. And so in August of 2020, we did set 7 standards for individual PFAS compounds. You can see those standards here. The 2 really relevant ones for today are PFOS at 16 parts per trillion, PFOA at 8 parts per trillion, but there are 7 of them, and all of those standards are health-based numbers based on protectiveness long-term for our most sensitive receptors, which Bill will talk to you about. Additionally, we've taken those same drinking water standards for our community systems, public water systems, and I have also been able to use those as groundwater cleanup criteria in the cases where you do have contamination that has gotten into the groundwater. So now we have standards that are in effect for the same standards that are in effect for cleanup of groundwater contamination. So that's what's being used when we look at this slide here and we see 171 PFAS sites around the state. All of those sites are using those same criteria for groundwater cleanup. The other thing I will just note is it looks like the state has got a lot of PFAS sites, and that maybe Michigan might have a serious problem. Well, Michigan is actually looking for the PFAS in our state. We're being very proactive. We're trying to do rapid investigation and assessment of PFAS sources in our state. And so we've investigated a lot of different sites. And so far we're up to 171 sites where we know that there are groundwater contamination that is above those groundwater cleanup criteria at these locations where we have some sort of a PFAS source. And so it's really because, you see a lot on this map is because Michigan's really being proactive in addressing those. Some of our other states in the country are just getting started or haven't been able to start at all. So just a heads up on that. The other thing I will say is that another thing that MPART has done is to have a citizens advisory work group. And this is made up of citizens from across our state, all geographic areas of residents who were impacted by PFAS. And so they have all gathered together on a citizens advisory work group for MPART to kind of be that sounding board for MPART on how to better engage and empower communities, how to educate our general public, and give us feedback. And so you may see some of those people on this webinar tonight or on this MPART town hall tonight. And they're here to listen and to help us do a better job when it comes to interfacing with our public and being able to be as transparent as possible. So that's very important to us. So I'm going to turn it over to Bill Farrell, our toxicologist with Department of Health and Human Services, and Bill's going to go through the health piece of it. Bill?
Thanks, Abby. Good evening, everyone. My name is Bill Farrell. I'm a toxicologist with the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. I also manage our environmental site contamination unit and also manage our PFAS site response operations. Next slide, please. So I first want to start off by talking a little bit about the role of public health. When I say public health, I mean the state health departments, MDHHS, and the local health departments. Now, our roles at these PFAS sites are to try and understand the health concerns facing your community. We work with EGLE, which is the lead investigatory agency, to develop plans to investigate and address health risks. EGLE leads the site investigations, and then MDHHS and the local health departments lead the public health planning and response. We evaluate PFAS exposures to residents in the community, and based on those evaluations, we recommend public health actions as needed. Next slide, please. So how can you be exposed to PFAS? The most significant route of exposure to PFAS is through ingestion of PFAS. And for these PFAS sites across the state, where we're seeing the greatest exposure is the PFAS in people's drinking water. Eating fish caught from water contaminated with PFAS is another potential route of exposure. As Abby mentioned, biota bioaccumulate PFAS, so we find PFAS in fish as well as other biota. Incidental swallowing of contaminated soil or dust. Eating food, packaged and materials containing PFAS. Using some consumer products that historically contain PFAS. And PFAS absorption through the skin is typically not a concern because PFAS is not easily absorbed through the skin. Next slide, please. So as Abby mentioned, we historically, the widespread use and occurrence of PFAS has resulted in people being exposed to PFAS. And people, when they're exposed to PFAS and PFAS gets in their body, the PFAS blood binds to proteins in the blood. So most everybody in the United States and actually across the world have some level of PFAS in their blood. And this slide shows the results of sampling for PFAS in blood in the population of the United States over time. It actually comes from a nutritional and health and examination survey that's been ongoing by CDC. Basically what they've been doing is they look at the nutritional habits of people, but also as part of that, they collect blood samples and measure the amount of certain chemicals that are known to bioaccumulate in people in their blood. So this slide shows the levels of several specific PFAS over time. And I want you to note the top two lines. The green line is the average concentration of PFOS in people in the United States blood, beginning in 2000 through 2014. And as you see, in 2000, the average concentration was about 30 micrograms per liter. And then you see over time to 2014, the average concentration declined. And the reason for that is that in 2002, the United States stopped the use and manufacture of PFOS, and PFOA in products that were manufactured in the United States. So as a result of no longer using these two specific PFAS in products manufactured in the United States, you saw a decline in exposure to these two particular PFAS, and consequently, a decline in the average concentration in people's blood over time. Next slide, please. So most of what we know about associated health outcomes from exposure to PFAS comes from studies of two specific PFAS, PFOA, PFOA, and PFOS, PFOS. And this slide shows some of those adverse health effects that have been identified. They include reduced fertility, high blood pressure or preeclampsia in pregnant women, small decreases in infant birth weight, higher cholesterol, especially total cholesterol and LDL cholesterol. Next slide, please. Thyroid disease, liver damage, decreased immune system response to vaccines, and developing certain types of cancer, in particular kidney and testicular cancer. And the one thing to keep in mind is that if you are exposed to high levels of PFAS, you may be more likely than the average person to develop some type of adverse health effect in the future. So it's not an absolute, it's a risk. Next slide, please. So this is some of the things that we look at when we evaluate people's residential well results. These are the multiple lines of consideration that we look at. We look at MDHHS comparison values, the residential well results, both individually and collectively, and site-specific information, what we know about the source, the geology, direction of groundwater flow, etc. Next slide, please. So the MDHHS comparison values are basically, we use those to determine the need for further investigation. And the comparison values are health-based, and they're lower of either MDHHS public health drinking water screening levels or the MPART health-based values or maximum contaminant levels that Abby mentioned before. Both the MDHHS screening levels and the MCLs were set to protect everyone, including the most sensitive populations, including fetuses and breastfed babies. Next slide, please. So the compare that we use to evaluate the results for drinking water samples, residential well drinking water samples. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we look at the results both individually and collectively to make determinations as far as public health response. In this slide, I want you to pay attention to the home highlighted in yellow under both scenarios. Now, for that particular home in this example, the levels that are present at the home are less than our comparison values. But on the scenario on the left, you see that the homes surrounding it are all non-detect for PFAS. And then the scenario on the right, you see that the homes surrounding that home in yellow are have exceedances of our comparison values. So these are two different scenarios with two different conditions when you look at the data collectively. And as a result of those different conditions, those different circumstances, we would make different public health response actions or recommendations to that particular home in yellow, depending on which of the scenarios they fall in. So even though the result is the same, because of looking at the data collectively, we would make different recommendations. Next slide, please. So I mentioned site-specific information. We look at the geology, how the direction of groundwater flow, plume conditions, if we're aware of it, and known sources, if we know what the source is and have an idea what the source strength is. All of those things go into our evaluating results and making site public health recommendations. Next slide, please. And then some of the public health responses, actions that we can take include no public health actions necessary. In cases, as is the case here, we would recommend a filter or use of alternative water. And our recommendation here with respect to a filter is an interim response action. In other words, what we're doing is we're recommending a filter right now in order to reduce exposures while we continue to do more investigation to understand what's going on long-term, and while we continue to evaluate and determine what a final decision or final remedy may be for the particular site. And these filters provide residents from protection against potential fluctuations of PFAS levels, again, while we continue to do investigation. Or another potential response action is just education, providing information on PFAS in drinking water to residents. And with that, I'll turn the presentation over to Steve Harrington from EGLE. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill, and thanks to each of you in the audience for taking the time to join us this evening. I'm Steve Harrington, and I'm with EGLE's Remediation and Redevelopment Division, and I work out of the Marquette District Office. Next slide, please. So this is a map of the former county airport, and I think as many of you know, it's located immediately north of US Highway 41 in Negaunee Township. And the old runway pretty much parallels the highway. It does have a north-south taxiway that transects the runway, but that is essentially the layout as the airport had operated. Next slide, please. So the former airport at that location operated from 1937 to 1999. So a little bit over 60 years of operation. And it's comprised of nearly 850 acres, which equates to just about 1 1/3 square miles. So it's a fairly sizable area. And research into previous operations have indicated there's potentially 5 areas where PFAS may have been utilized, stored, or discharged. So those areas include a former fire training area. I believe the airport was required to conduct annual or semi-annual fire suppression exercises. And the material was then, of course, the products were stored in the former fire and rescue building. That's where the emergency vehicles were deployed from. And then we have a couple of septic fields that may have received PFAS runoff water or discharge water, as well as a potential wastewater or stormwater lagoon. Next slide, please. So I'd like to point out those areas, if I may. So here's a close-up map of the old runway. So the area of our greatest interest is area number 4, which is the former fire training exercise location. Also, Area 3, which is down to the south of the runway, is where the products were stored and the emergency vehicles were discharged or deployed from. And then we have Area 5, which is a septic field, as well as Area 10, which was to the east of that, which is a main septic field. And then the possible stormwater lagoon is identified as Area 7. I believe that's denoted by a yellow triangle there. So those are the suspect areas that we're looking into. But as you can see from this map, we're also doing quite a bit of sampling throughout the remainder of the airport property to determine with more specificity direction of groundwater flow and surface water transport. So I'll ask for the next slide, please. So the airport or the county received a grant to conduct some sampling on the airport property, the former airport property itself. And that grant was awarded in fall of 2020. And the investigation began just this past April, where the county's consultant collected 9 surface water samples from the airport property itself. So by surface water, I mean ponded bodies of water, drainage courses, and wherever water is expressed at the surface. Additionally, prior to receiving the information from those surface water samples, Eagle initiated some residential well sampling around the entire perimeter of the airport, just to ensure that we, we're making steps to identify any potential exposures should PFAS be found on the airport. Next slide, please. So we had sent out nearly 50 letters to residents that were targeted for sampling. We received a pretty robust response. And during the week of May 17th, we did sample a total of 33 locations, 30 of which were residential wells. And we received those results on June 4th, so just earlier this month. So of those 33 samples that were collected, 8 of the 30 homes had detection. We had 1 home which was over the drinking water criteria for 2 particular compounds, and all 8 homes were offered filter installation. Next slide, please. So this is a map which indicates where those samples were collected. These are the residential well sampling locations. So the black dots represent areas where we had attempted to engage with the homeowner and collect a sample. We were not successful during that sampling event. We may be revisiting those homes. The green dots are where we did collect a sample and no PFAS compounds were detected. And our detection limits are pretty low. They're on the order of 2 parts per trillion. So they're extremely minute quantities that we're attempting to identify. The yellow homes, or the yellow dots, are where PFAS was detected at some level, but not above the established drinking water criteria. And then you'll see that the singular red dot is the single residence where we did identify PFAS and PFOA at or above the drinking water criteria. Next slide, please. We also sampled the water supply to the apartment complex, which is just south of the airport runway. And that did have a singular detection of PFOS at the detection limit. That well will be resampled in the future. As far as the municipal supply, the Negaunee Township relies on groundwater wells that are remote from this location. Those have been sampled and monitoring is continuing just to ensure that the community water supply remains safe. Next slide, please. So this is a map which identifies the water courses on the airport property itself and off to the west. But as you can see, groundwater flows from Baldwin-Kiln Lake southward, and then along a drainage course along the southern edge of the runway, where it then leaves the airport and eventually flows into the Carp River. Next slide, please. So this depicts the results of the county's sampling. The county's consultant, as I mentioned, collected surface water samples in late April, and they collected a total of 9 samples, and they did identify PFOS in 7 of those samples. The greatest concentration being at the former fire training area, where there was 61.8 parts per trillion identified at that location. Next slide, please. So Eagle, my agency, is going to go back and do some additional residential well sampling. There were some intervening homes and some additional homes that we'd like to pick up. We also want to confirm what the concentrations were because they may be somewhat variable. We want to, just for quality assurance purposes, resample some of the homes where we had previously identified certain levels. And at this point, we're looking at the week of July 12th. I think that's a pretty firm date when that resampling would occur. MDHHS also does routine resampling. The further investigation of the airport property under the MDOT issued grant will be occurring the week of July the 5th and probably take about 10 days to complete. That will involve the collection of soil, groundwater, and some additional surface water samples. So we do expect to have a much more in-depth look at what the subsurface and surface conditions are at the airport. Next slide, please. So this map incorporates quite a bit of information, but these are proposed sampling locations where some groundwater monitoring wells will be put in on the airport property itself. It shows where those wells will be shallow or nested wells, which means it will be a deep well and a shallow well next to each other. The proposed additional surface water sampling are shown by the gray triangles. And it will be a pretty robust investigation, both additional residential well sampling as well as sampling on the airport property during the month of July. Next slide, please. And with that, I think that concludes what I can provide right now, but I do want to say that this site is listed on the MPART website as an area of concern, and further information would be available there. And with that, I'll turn it over to Abby Hendershot.
Thank you, Steve. Excellent job. Thanks for that. I'm just going to take 2 seconds and we'll see if I can get this to work. You guys still seeing the MPART website now? I hope you are still seeing it. So this is the MPART website with the Michigan PFAS Action Response Team. You'll see there. We've got some popular pages down here in the middle. This one for PFAS sites will take you right to the listing of all those sites that we talked about today, all 171, and the former Marquette Airport for Negaunee will be on this list. So you can jump in and get those updates as we go through. So I just want to make sure everybody knows that's there. The other thing to note is if you want to join our Citizens Advisory Work Group, you can find an application, membership registration and stuff in here. And we also have our MPART calendar, which is always on our public meetings thing. So all of these public meetings are open to everybody. So we have all kinds of different meetings for all kinds of different sites around the state, but they're all put on our calendar. So you'll see tonight's meeting is here. And then as we go into July, there'll be more meetings. So just a heads up on that. And then
Hey, Abby?
Yep.
Abby, before you leave, would you hit on, click on investigations again for us, please? And then click on areas of interest, because actually this site doesn't qualify as an MPART site yet.
Oh, that's
Go
right.
down a little bit. There's the former Marquette County.
There.
Interest.
Thank you.
You
We're
betcha.
in the process of combining the areas of interest with the regular sites, and that's supposed to be done any day. So anyways, it's my mistake. Thanks for catching that, Amy. So former Marquette area of interest, as soon as we get a groundwater well on site at the airport that actually has concentrations, which is just a matter of time. It'll be elevated to an actual MPART site. But you click on that, it'll have the same write-up with the same maps that you see during the presentation right there. So you can click on those, download them if you want, and then it's got all of the more details. And as we get updated results, we will continue to update this website with additional information. So, and it's got Steve's email and phone number there too. So good catch. All right, I'm going to go back to, let's downsize that. And then I think then we bring in Les to help us do questions and answers.
All right, thank you, Abby. Thank you, Steve. We do have several questions that have come in already. Just want to remind everyone to go ahead and type those questions in the Q&A. If you would like to raise your hand, you can click the hand icon at the bottom of your screen, and myself and Jim Ostrowski, who's our co-host, will be looking for you to unmute your microphone. So, but we do have several questions. Before we get to that, I just want to report out that we have at present about 29 attendees watching the webinar right now. So there's still several that are watching and listening. So with that, Abby and Steve, are you ready? Let's get into these questions. Steve, I think the first couple here deal with well sampling. And I know you touched on this during your presentation, but the question that is being asked is, well, when will the additional testing be done for wells that are in the area adjacent to the well that tested high? And then there was a second question, wanted to know if the wells that test high, when will those be retested?
That would all be conducted during the singular sampling event, which would be a multi-day event during the week of July 12th. And all of those homeowners will be contacted. Now, I understand there's some homeowners who have not yet been sampled, but are interested in receiving those services. So some of those have contacted the local health department. That contact would be Patrick Jacuzzo. And I would encourage homeowners who live in the areas where you see the yellow dots or even the red dots that please reach out to us if you have those concerns. But that sampling and resampling will occur during the week of, it's anticipated to occur during the week of July 12th. And yes, the individuals who have been previously sampled and shown a detection will be resampled. Not every detection, but the ones that are of clearly the one over the regulatory limit.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Next question concerns providing water to homes that test elevated. Is there a time for when safe water will be plumbed to a home or for full filtration systems?
So a permanent remedy has not been determined yet, and it really depends on the further sampling, but also it depends on the capacity of the municipal system, such things as a storage tank capacity, elevated pressure tanks, potentially having to blast rock to extend the municipal system. So those details are going to require some engineering and planning to determine what the most effective extension of the municipal supply may be. So I am afraid that is going to take some planning, some funding, and that has not yet been precisely determined at this point. There's just not enough information present.
Yeah, that's a good answer, Steve. I would also add that we want to take this in phases so that we understand the full scope of the contamination before we determine that final remedy, so that we can be holistic in the response. And so understand definitely the concern, but that's why the filters are being given out so that we can kind of buy ourselves some time to do that, to get the rest of that investigation done, understand what the full, because we're really talking about not just the 2D model, but the 3D model, understanding both the depth component of the contamination as well as how widespread it is across the airport. So those are all important to understanding the final design and engineering capacity necessary for something like this.
Okay. Thank you, Steve and Abby. The next question, this one is for local health department or MDHHS. This concerns skin exposure to PFAS. So the question is, what level of dermal exposure is considered dangerous?
Yeah, I'll answer that question. DHHS, we have not established a dermal exposure limit, but we have done risk assessment looking at dermal exposures using conservative scenarios to assess the level of exposures and to assess what the potential risks are. And for the most part, at the levels where we get to where we see there might be a potential concern for exposure to dermal are much, much higher than the levels that we see typically in the drinking water wells that are impacted across the state. So I guess to answer that question directly, we don't have a specific level. However, we have looked at that exposure route, and we do see that where we start to see a potential for concerns with respect to exposure, the levels that we see in the drinking water wells that are impacted with PFAS across the state are not typically at those particular levels where we see a potential concern.
Thanks, Bill. The next question, I believe, is for you, Steve. This concerns the well that tested above criteria. The question is it possible the well may have been contaminated during the sampling round, or if the question also wants to know if there's anything unique about the well that tested above criteria. Is the well deeper? Is it shallower? Is there a plan to resample?
I'm glad that question was asked. And in fact, the sampling protocols for PFAS are quite strict because there can be interferences during the sample collection process, as well as just false, testing artifacts. So that particular well was, I believe, at 40. That was actually a pretty shallow well. That was a 28-foot deep well. And there is underlying bedrock at this site. So there are some limitations on how deep certain wells can be. But to answer that question, we do collect quality assurance samples during the sampling event. So there are such things as field blanks where pre-filled water is taken out into the field and returned. And we also run duplicate samples just to make sure that the analytic is reliable and repeatable. So we are going to resample these wells, but the QA/QC protocols are very important here. And those concentrations can also vary somewhat depending on seasonality. And we do want to get a good sense for what that variability might be. So that well will in fact be resampled, as well as several of the others.
Thank you, Steve. Next question we have, Abby, during your presentation, you talked about PFAS in everyday consumer products. And Steve, you talked about various aspects of the investigation around the airport. This next question deals with Marquette Mountain and other ski hills in the area. And the question is, has the use of fluorinated ski waxes, could that possibly contribute to groundwater contamination?
That is the first time I've gotten that question. That's a great question. I don't have an answer to a fluorinated ski wax. I will have to look into it and get back to that particular participant, because that's something I don't know. You would have to use quite a bit of it over time for long periods of time. And I'm not, the fluorination process for a lot of consumer products didn't start until the 60s, even into the 70s. And so I don't know how widespread, if it would be in all ski waxes. So that would be something we would have to look into. I have trouble believing it would lead to groundwater contamination, but that's not something I've ever seen tested. So we will look at that.
Thank you, Abby. Related question. It was noted by the requester that, or the questioner, that that the ski hill is located near the Carp River, which is also near the airport. Is there any concern for any impacts to the Carp River?
I can answer that question. So additional testing is going to be conducted by Eagle. We were unable to test the outfalls emanating from the airport property due to the dry conditions at the time in late April. And the Water Resources Division of Eagle does intend to go back and collect samples both of the Carp River as well as additional surface water testing. So that is absolutely going to be looked at and a very important factor in this.
Okay, all right, thank you, Steve. Steve, next question. Is there any reason to be concerned about any sites that are a bit further away from the airport site?
Well, we are looking at direction of groundwater travel. We are, of course, looking at flow directions of the water courses on the surface. So I believe that the testing that we've done, we've identified what would be realistically expected in terms of migration from the airport property. Now, that's not to say that we may end up identifying some particular migration pathway that we would further test. But at this point, if you're an additional half mile away or further, I can't really see any migration route for these chemicals.
Okay, all right, thanks, Steve. In terms of remediation of PFAS, contaminated soil, has there been any consideration for use of placing this in concrete to be used in infrastructure?
That's a really good question. We are looking at what we're considering like amendments to different PFAS waste materials to see if we can find a way to bind it up, sequester it in those materials, and potentially either solidify it or at least stabilize it for disposal in landfills. I know several of the universities are studying that particular question, and so we are waiting for some of their results to see about it, because I think that's kind of what we're thinking is what we need, some way to sequester this stuff in place so that it can be properly disposed, that the landfill doesn't have to worry about it leaching back out into their leachate, but also so that people have a way to properly manage this stuff. At this point, concrete's very porous, and this stuff moves very easily through all kinds of materials. So it would have to be something that have to be specifically made to capture and trap PFAS. And I don't think we're there yet with the technology, but I like the idea, and I'm hoping that the universities continue with their investigation and research.
Thanks, Abby.
Mm-hmm.
Steve, I believe this one's coming back to you. Area 5, or the 5 areas that you pointed during your presentation, is there anything unusual or very typical of the geology underneath those 5 sites?
Well, we really don't have any specific information at this point as to the geology under those precise areas, but there have been quite a number of previous studies of the airport geology due to historic fuel releases, as well as releases of some solvent material. So the airport property itself has been studied in the past. So the local geology is typically sandy glacial alluvium with some interspersed gravel seams, but by and large, it's a sandy overburden lying on bedrock. So there is some, and the bedrock does outcrop in various areas. So as far as groundwater flow, what we know at this point is groundwater flow seems to be divergent from the center of the site. So there's a component to groundwater flow, and keep in mind, groundwater migrates very slowly in the subsurface. It's not like subsurface rivers or anything. So groundwater migrates on the order of several feet per year. So it's slowly moving in what are called down gradient or down slope directions. So groundwater from the center of the site is moving southwesterly and also southeasterly. So that's the information we have at this point. But when the additional testing is done in early July, that will involve geoprobing, water table, taking static water level elevations, and determining what the actual flow patterns are, as well as the precise geology in those locations.
Thank you, Steve. For MDHHS and local health, we have a question concerning the filters. What type of filters are being given out, and specifically, what is the filtration technique utilized? So how do the filters work?
What we, you want me to take it, Patrick, or do you want to take it, or?
Either or. If it's an Aquasana filter, the majority of the ones that we have on order right now are activated carbon is the element that removes PFAS, but also reverse osmosis is the next stage on those. We did have one resident so far that opted out of the reverse osmosis part of it because he wanted to maintain mineral levels in his water.
And I would add that the filters are ANSI 53 certification or P473 certification for the removal of PFOA and PFOS. That's important point to remember, is that the filters that we use are certified.
And they are
PFOA.
point of use filters, so they would be an under sink mounted type of filter that's going to handle drinking water at one location within the home.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you, Patrick. Thank you. Next question. This one concerns, so there's two parts to this question. One is wondering not if there's been any discussion about the extension of municipal water around the site. And the second part of the question, it comes back to the dermal question earlier. Is there any reason that children would be more at risk to dermal exposure to PFAS than adults?
I'm going to start with the skin absorption part of it, Bill, and then we can go on to the municipal water part.
Yeah, I mean, when we do our risk assessment, we look at, we use conservative exposure scenarios, and we assess the most sensitive population. So we look at exposures by both children and adults. So that's sensitive populations are considered when we do our risk assessment protocols and techniques. And I will say, with respect to dermal exposures, we are continuing to evaluate the literature, evaluate the information. MPART has what we is called a human health work group. And one of the things that the human health work group is looking at are dermal exposures, particularly as new information, new studies come out. We're looking at these studies, again, to evaluate the studies so that we can, if we can make proper public health determinations and recommendations. So the evaluation is ongoing. It continues as science develops. We continue to keep abreast of the science and evaluate. And with respect to dermal exposures, it is something that we are looking at closely with our human health work group.
Okay.
And Bill, I think it's important to remember that because you ingest water all day, your primary route for PFAS exposure is through ingestion. Whereas if you're bathing in it or perhaps swimming in a lake, it's a very point in time. It's not happening 24/7. It might be happening for 20 minutes in a 24-hour day. And so the exposure duration is much shorter. And and obviously, the skin makes a very good protectant. So I think this particular participant has actually attached a PFAS study exposure for that. Maybe you could, I don't know if you know about this one, Bill, but
that's one of we are looking at that study. Yeah, and as you said, Abby, with respect to dermal exposure, there's a time element to it, as well as the skin is a barrier, so it's not as opposed to ingestion where it immediately absorbed into the body. With skin, there's a time to it, and those are things that we look at when we do our risk assessment to evaluate those exposures.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Abby. Next question is, so we have an attendee who has had their well tested but have not received results. So how would any of our attendees that are on tonight or who may be watching the webinar recording later, if they haven't received their water well test results, who can they contact to get those results?
You can contact any of us.
Yeah,
Bill or Steve specifically, or even Patrick, or even type your address in this question and answer box, and we will get you an answer and a reply back tomorrow. Figure out
Yeah.
what's going on.
Yeah, and MDHHS is working on sending out letters and the specific results for each non-detect home. So if you have not received results, I'm quite certain you are a non-detect home because we've contacted all homes that have had detects so far.
Mhm. It is a little bit, if they don't see the dot indicating their home, I guess we want to make sure that we know what address that is, so we can specifically follow up and make sure nothing was mistakenly left out or whatever.
All right, thank you. I think, Bill, you made reference to that MDHHS is looking into that study for the dermal exposure. The next question, one of our attendees lives near the cemetery and would like to know if this area is threatened or is there a concern there?
I guess I can take that question initially, and I have to admit that although I've lived in Marquette County for the past 32 years, I'm not certain which cemetery they're referring to or where the precise location of that is. So perhaps, Patrick, would you have that information?
I think there are two cemeteries in Negaunee Township. Is that correct? I know we got Nick on the phone here, Nick Leach. I mean, he was on the call or on the presentation here.
Is there,
but
He's from the
or,
township. He might know, but you know, there's a cemetery that is south of the airport property by probably like a mile. So that, in my opinion, that would be far outside of what
I
we're
agree.
looking at here.
I agree. But if this individual would like to further communicate with us and provide his address, I think we could give them more concrete
Mhm.
information.
Nick has his hand raised. I can unmute his mic here.
Hi, good evening, everyone. This is Nick Leach. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right, yeah, so Negaunee Township does have two cemeteries. We have one west of here, south of here, if you were to take this map and head down Forge Road towards 492. There's a cemetery just east of the Carp River there. I would think that that's probably where they're guessing or where they're coming from. So on this map, yeah, if you move your cursor to the east, keep going.
Is it near the Carp River Gardens by any chance?
No, it's south of US 41 actually. So if you know where the Iron Ore Museum is, your cursor
Sure.
is getting closer. If you head, yep, now go south. Keep going. There you go, right there. That open area right there is the cemetery. That's the main largest cemetery that we have in the township closest to this proximity. We also have one further east at the east entrance of Midway Drive on US 41, near where, if you know where Associated Ready Mix is, it's
Yeah.
close to there.
Yeah, I can't see how either of those two locations could possibly be affected by this particular airport operation.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Nick. Let's see. Oh, here we are. So next question. This one, now we get into fish and animal questions. What about the potential bioaccumulation in fish and animals? Will fish and animals be tested for PFAS exposure?
And I do believe that we looked at, we didn't have any fish sampling in the area. Is that right, Steve? I think we looked at that.
My understanding is that Water Resources Division is taking that into consideration. I don't know what the nature of that sample collection may be, but that would be a question for one of our staff in the Water Resources Division.
Yeah, so when they come out to do, they are doing rounds around the state to sample, to do not only surface water sampling, but also fish sampling. So they take both a split, co-located pair. So whenever they take a fish sample, they take a surface water sample so they can kind of understand what the concentration of surface water is to the concentration in the fish. And because fish bioaccumulate, the older the fish, sometimes the higher the concentration. And so that's something that is important to know. PFOS is the primary PFAS that seems to bioaccumulate more than others in fish. That's usually what they're finding. And we did not put up the Eat Safe Fish guide, but there, if you type in Eat Safe Fish, there is a guide that comes up by Department of Health and Human Services that talks about any, fish restrictions in your area. Usually those, guidelines are based on mercury exposure in fish or mercury concentrations of fish, which we have across the state. PFOS doesn't drive too many of these, unless we've got very, very, very high levels like we do at some of our Air Force bases where we've got significant concentrations going in. So we are looking at bioaccumulation in fish across the state. And so that's an ongoing one. And there are some limited studies on deer. We're looking at doing some additional testing on mallard ducks. That's in the works. That won't be done for a little bit, but that's in the works. And then we're closely watching what's going on across the rest of the country for additional animal testing, because I know our friends in Wisconsin are also doing testing. And so we're kind of keeping up with both Wisconsin and Minnesota to see what they're testing to see not only how they're doing it, but to kind of compare results across the regions.
Thank you. All right, we still have 27 attendees hanging with us. This is great. This is great. Next question. This is again, these are some new dermal questions. Dermal skin contact. The questions here relate to bathing, pool time with and in the tub. Question related to bathing of a newborn and breastfeeding.
Well, in terms of when we our evaluation of dermal exposures, as I said, we looked at a scenario where an infant, basically 6 months old, a young infant, would sit in water for a couple hours, and we looked at what the potential exposure is, the risks, and that's kind of the scenario that we use to assess dermal exposures. Okay, so we do consider infants, young children in evaluating the potential risk from dermal exposure. As far as breastfeeding, as I mentioned, the PFAS do bioaccumulate, and the comparison values, the health-based values that we developed, considered exposure from breastfeeding. So a woman who has been exposed to PFAS in drinking water, there is the potential for having PFAS exposed by the infant from breastfeeding. So it's something that there is a potential for that happening, and it is our health-based values in drinking water were developed to be protective of that particular type of transfer.
All right, thanks, Bill. Just a follow-up, what about cuts and scrapes? Is there an issue there with cuts and scrapes?
Well, with cuts and scrapes, again, the skin is abraded, and there's a, with any absorption, there's a potential for a more direct route of exposure. But again, in terms of what the significance of that is in terms of exposure, I really can't tell you, quite honestly. It's something that, if there's a concern, it may be something that you might want to consider if you do have a potential for being exposed to, again, I would say very, high levels of PFAS in the water. So,
Bill, refresh my memory, when the MCLs were developed for drinking water, including the DHHS health guidelines, those considered what, 30 or 32 years of exposure, drinking 4 liters a day for those whole 32 years, right? Wasn't that the scenario
yeah,
put out there?
it's 30 years of exposure, a lifetime of exposure. And the amount of water, I don't know the exact amount, but it is, I think a couple of liters or something. But again, yeah, and so that there gets a point where, if you're exposed daily over that long period of time, you do build it up in your body, and so there's potential for transfer of that during breastfeeding.
Which is why it's so important that we want to be able to give people the filters now, so that while the investigation takes time, they don't continue to be exposed to those PFAS sources long term. That's
yeah, and I guess the other thing too is we're still because of the benefits of breastfeeding, we're still recommending that, if that breastfeeding, we're not recommending not to breastfeed. We think that it's still, the benefits right now outweigh the potential concerns with respect to, potential PFAS in the blood in that, so.
Okay. Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Abby. I saw a note, I think there's some more fish information, resource information. Did I see that?
Is that in the?
From Amy?
That's me. So yeah, I found a note from Brandon Armstrong, who's our fish and surface water guy. We have not collected fish in this area. I can tell you that they do intend to get back to sample in the Keweenaw Peninsula later this year. That will include the Dead and Kelsey River watershed, which includes tributaries that flow from the Negaunee area to Lake Superior. So there's no information yet to indicate that fish is going to be part of that, but we'll get back and circle back on that.
Okay, thank you, Amy. There's another excellent question that's come in. I don't think we've had this one. Question is, are bottled water sources sampled for PFAS?
That is a great question. So I'll put a caveat on it. If it's a bottled water source from Michigan, they would be tested as part of our community water supply testing or as a type 1, type 2 well under the Safe Drinking Water Act. Outside of Michigan, I guess it would have to be in the area where it would be tested, where it was originally sourced from. But if all sources of community water supply in the state of Michigan have been tested, so we know what those concentrations are. And I do believe that there are requirements for testing at the commercial level within the state of Michigan as well. But, it's not something that I've seen the results of for in our state. I do recall seeing just recently a article about PFAS bottled water across the country. And I'm sure that's where that question is coming from. But, for in Michigan, they would be testing for it because we would be testing the source,
Thanks, Abby. There is another question here related to other PFAS potential sites in the Upper Peninsula. Would this information if someone's interested in following what other sources are out there or being investigated, I'm assuming that the PFAS MPART page would be the best source of that information for following.
Yeah. Whoops. Here, let me share. If you can still see my screen. So I believe this participant wants to know about KI Sawyer. If they go to the PFAS MPART site, go to PFAS sites, and we will have, and you could probably just type in KI Sawyer, but it's going to be KI Sawyer Air Force Base in Gwynn. And here's a map of the Air Force Base. Here's the background, just like we've got for this particular site. A lot of information as well as stuff. I know they are doing ongoing on-site and off-site groundwater contamination. And I do know that they have tested some of the homes up in, if you can see this little tiny map, there are some homes that they've already tested off-site. So that is ongoing, but it would probably take a whole nother town hall to go through all the details of it. So feel free to use the MPART website. And if you've got questions, let us know. I don't think the project manager for this one is on there, but you can always shoot us any of us an email and we can help you out connecting you with the project manager.
Thanks, Abby. We presently do not have any new questions. In fact, we don't have any questions at the moment, and we still have 26 attendees with us, which is great. Any additional thoughts that may have come to mind to share with our attendees while the time that we have left?
I'll throw one out. This whole process of doing investigation work is iterative. So we do this in phases. We do it very methodically and deliberately so that we get really good data. MPART is based on science. We're very data-driven, collaboration system. So it's very important that we get good, high-quality data, that we can give you good, based our health advice based on that good data. And so we're going to continue to going through this investigation, with Steve's guidance and helping with the airport and with local public health, continue to do that stepwise approach through this. And so it's going to take a little bit of time, but that's part of the reason that we got out and have been doing these precautionary sampling around some of these airports. So if you follow us on our PFAS website, we are doing precautionary sampling around a lot of our airports in not only the Upper Peninsula, but the Lower Peninsula as well. And so we've got a few more town halls to go to talk about, residential drinking water results. And, for the most part, these results look good. We have the one home that definitely has a hit. It's going to get resampled. We will continue to see if we can figure out what that source might be from or what that data is telling us, but it's too early to really paint that full picture. So Steve, you want to add anything to that?
No, and I think we've really covered a lot of ground here, and I know it's can be very intimidating and complicated information, but I do want to thank everyone for their interest and their excellent questions. And as other things occur to you, please don't hesitate to reach out to any of us, and we'll do our best to provide you with the answers that we can. But again, it's all data-driven. It's all based on science. And I'm grateful for everyone's cooperation and interest in this.
And so I'm just throwing your name back up there, Steve. So if anybody wants to reach out, Steve Harrington, and here's his email and phone number. So
this is a great photo op right here, if you have your phones.
Yep, it is. So last chance for hands. Anybody showing up here, Les?
Just thank yous from our attendees. I don't see any new hands. There are no new hands. And yeah, I think that's it. I think one thing I'll add is that just a reminder for anyone that joined us after we went through housekeeping is that the webinar tonight has been recorded, is being recorded, and we will be sharing the link to the webinar recording within the next day or so. We send it out for closed captioning, so it might be a day, but we'll get that posted to Eagle's YouTube channel, and then we'll have it linked also to the Michigan PFAS Action Response page for this site of interest. So stay tuned for that. You know, there's a good opportunity to share this information with friends or colleagues who were not able to attend this evening.
I just wanted to add to the bottled water testing question. The bottled water source that we're contracted to use is Norway Springs, and that's a Michigan source, so it is tested for PFAS.
Perfect. Thank you, Patrick.
Okay. Well, Abby, I don't have any new hands or no new questions.
Excellent, I think. And we can, and I think we usually post a copy of the PDF of the slides to the website as well. So if anybody wants slides, we can share those around with the group as well.
Okay.
So, excellent.
Abby, would you like to close us out?
I think I'm done. I think everybody needs to go have a good night. Feel free to call us. If you think of more questions, shoot us an email, shoot Steve an email. Steve, you are going on vacation for a few days, a week?
Yeah, that's correct. I'm going to have limited availability for all of next week and probably until after the 4th of July. But, you know, if it's an important question, I do want to respond to that. So probably the best way to reach me is through email. And then I will be checking that and trying to respond as quickly as I can.
Mm-hmm. So if you're going to email Steve, email one of us as well, and we'll just make sure everything gets taken care of. But just really appreciate everyone being here tonight. Like we said, this is just the first step. As we get additional data, as Steve has got additional results, we'll continue to communicate, continue to work through local public health, state public health, so that we can do our best for all of you as our community. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.